In this video, I want to walk you through another one of my actual client projects and show you kind of a unique camera movement and how I handled it. So let's just play this scene back. So we've got two people pull out to reveal it's a concert and then slide up to transition to the next set of graphics, and then it just transitions out. So the thing that's kind of unique about this is that the camera's moving backwards and not really stopping before it moves upwards. And looking back at it now, it honestly is a little bit more jerky than I would like it to be. I'd rather have this movement be really consistent, constant, and smooth from this scene to this scene. So I'm going to show you how I would handle that now with experience I've had since doing this project using some other assets. But before we get there, I want to point out that even though this is a very flat, vectory style, I was able to add a lot of depth just by making this crowd. And if we look at this from the top view and zoom out a little, you can see how I built this. Ignore that lens flare for now, but right here is my stage, my speakers, and the two music artists, and then we have a crowd. All these different layers are the crowd spread out, and here's my camera down here. So even though I'm working with very stylized, flat, vector-looking characters, I'm able to create this scene in 3D space. But we've also got some other elements going on here. I made these fireworks with a plugin called Trapcode Particular, which is a particle emitter, and it's really great for making things like explosions and fireworks. But then there's also this lens flare that's being generated using Video Copilot's optical flares, and you'll notice that this is being positioned using a light. If I move this around, see that that's going to change the position of the lens flare. So that's how you can use optical flares in 3D space. You can tell it to look at a light source and make a flare there. And in this particular scene, I don't want that light to actually affect any of my artwork, so I disabled all the material options for all of these characters. They don't accept lights, they don't cast shadows. I'm still maintaining this very stylistic design choice while implementing this lens flare into the entire scene. But there's just another example of how we can use 3D space and layers to create a really interesting scene. Now let's move to another project, which you can actually download and follow along with me if you'd like. Okay, so this project is this camping scene that I'm calling The Great Outdoors, and I'll just play this back so you can see what the final looks like. That's all there is to it. It's a very simple little animation, but as you can see, the camera moves out very smoothly and transitions to that upward movement very smoothly. It's all very consistent and very constant. This is what I was talking about with the last example of the concert, where I'd rather have this nice sweeping movement that kind of curves into the upward movement. And what I did in this situation was actually introduce a second object to control the camera for that second camera move. If I bring up my keyframes, I'll show you how I did this. If I move this null object out of the way so those keyframes aren't influencing anything, this first set of keyframes just moves from tight in at the campsite to this wide angle, and it just kind of moves back and upwards slightly. If I undo and bring this second null back in, what this is doing is going from this zoomed out view to raising the camera up so we reveal the text and frame the rest of this shot. And if I put this back to where it's supposed to be, then we can see exactly what's happening. This first camera move, which is being keyframed right on the camera's position, is zooming out, and before it's even finished and eased into this nice, smooth resting point, the null object, the secondary control of moving upwards on that y-axis, is starting to ease in and lift the camera up even though it's still moving backwards. And that creates a much smoother transition between those two camera moves. So it's a really simple technique, but just parenting that camera to the null and controlling the movement of the camera from two different layers makes for a really pleasing single camera move. And like I said, this is a project file that you can also download yourself and try and recreate these camera movements. The way that I created this myself was by first basically designing this frame in Illustrator, because I knew this is what the final result should look like. And then I transferred all of the artwork into After Effects and animated things like these trees. So if we take a look at one of these comps, I had just broken up the layers into shape layers, and I added this random wiggle movement using a combination of effects and just animation. I'm actually controlling all of that rotation through wiggle expressions on the rotation values of these individual layers, and I added a couple of slider controls to control how fast and how much they're moving. We've also got a bend effect on top of everything that's just tilting the tree completely. But I just did that for each instance of the trees and then just populated the entire scene with them. Again, if we take a look at the top view, you can see that I just spaced all these individual elements out. So this center part here is my campfire and the tent, and you can see that I kind of color-coded these with labels just so I could identify them easier. But if I zoom out even further, there's the tree lines and the mountains in the back, the moon, the clouds. This object right here is the floor, and it's just there to fill in the base of the frame. But if we take a look at this at maybe the custom view 1, I can now pan around this, and you can see that I've just spaced all of these individual elements out in 3D space to give a lot of sense of depth. Nothing complex, just a lot of careful placement and framing with the camera. But it all comes back to this final frame that I designed in Illustrator. This is what drove the entire scene. Another really interesting thing that you can do with 3D layers in After Effects is actually pre-compose them while preserving their 3D placement. So in this scene, I have all of these copies of the grass and then all of these groupings of trees. I can actually collapse all of that down while preserving everything that you see here exactly as it is. So let's just start with the grass. If I select all of my grass layers and go up to Layer, Pre-Compose, I'll just rename this Grass Pre-Comp, and then click OK. Now, my composition did update and the grass is not looking the way that it should. If I solo this layer, it is a flat 2D comp. There's no depth to it at all. But if you're familiar with this continuously rasterized switch, you also know that it has another name called collapse transformations. So the continuously rasterized feature is for when you bring in Illustrator artwork or vector artwork and you always want it to look crisp, no matter what scale it's set to. That's what continuously rasterizing does. And we can see that is always active on text layers because they are vector. But that exact same switch, for whatever reason, the After Effects team decided to use that same switch to do what's called the collapse transformations. Watch what happens when I click the switch on this pre-comp. All of that grass goes back to where it was. And if I switch to my custom view 1 and orbit around, sure enough, all of that grass is spaced out in 3D space. So let me unsolo this, and there you go. You can see all that grass is still there. Now if I select this pre-comp, you'll notice it's still a 2D layer, even though that's displaying in 3D. But if I make this pre-comp a 3D pre-comp, we get a bounding box around all of those layers, and we can even see the individual bounding boxes for all of the different layers within that pre-comp. Now the anchor point is kind of way up in the center of the scene just because that's where the center of the pre-comp was when we pre-composed it. But I can rotate this around however I want, and you can see this truly is all of the 3D layers just as they were before I pre-comped them. So let's do the same thing with all of these trees. I'll grab all of those trees, just shift click on all of them, press Command Shift C to pre-compose, and I'll call this Trees Pre-Comp. Click OK. Then make sure to enable the collapse transformations and the 3D layer switch, and all of these trees are now preserved exactly as they were before. And what's great is that it's even preserving intersection of layers. So if I zoom in here, take a look at this tree right here that's in front of the tent. If I move this back a little bit, it gets to a point where right there the tree shifts behind the tent. So these pre-comped layers are behaving exactly as if all of these 3D layers were still in this comp. And they're rendering on top of or behind what they're supposed to. And as you can see, my timeline is now a lot cleaner because there are less layers to look at.